Hello. In this lecture, we're going to cover the second half of Chapter 21 on the European empires in the New World, the Americas, and talk a little bit about what happened out in the Pacific. So this covers the second and third sections in Chapter 21, but vast majority of it will be on the second section called Colonial Society in the Americas. Very little about the Pacific or Oceania. In fact, if you look at the list of key terms, and again, I'll remind you that whenever you're in class or listening to lectures like this, it's a good idea to have those key terms with you so you can follow along, check your spelling and all that. Only one key term comes from that last third section in chapter 21. So the key terms are often a good way to kind of figure out where you should focus your attention. All right, colonial societies in the Americas. We touched on this a little bit in the first lecture about this chapter, but here we're going to go into a lot more detail about these certain aspects of it. In particular, the multicultural aspect of it. You could argue that almost all empires are by definition multicultural because usually one group or one people conquer a bunch of other people and rule over them. So there's always a mixture of cultures or peoples in empires. But in the case of the European empires in the Americas, it was a slightly different and more complicated multicultural system, in part because there's a lot more mixing and mingling between them. And we saw or talked a little bit about that in the first lecture on chapter 21. If you recall, we talked a little bit about Donna Marina and her children who were mestizo. In this section, the book basically argues that, at least in the Latin American countries, the Spanish and Portuguese empires, it calls them mestizo societies because there was so much racial, ethnic, and cultural mingling. It talks about how in the Spanish colonies, most of the settlers went to Mexico. And as we saw or talked about earlier, many of the settlers who went there were single males, and they ended up in relationships with Native American women, or at least the ones that survived the diseases and death and destruction. And their children were called mestizos, right? Mestizo is a mixed ancestry involving Europeans and Native Americans. And they become the largest percentage of people in the Spanish colonies, especially in Mexico. There were also, of course, mestizos, mixed race people in South America, Peru, and those Spanish colonies down there, but it's especially prominent in Mexico. In Brazil, the situation was even more multicultural, because besides having relationships and marriages with native people, the Portuguese settlers often engaged in relations with African slaves who came to the colonies to work in the sugar plantations and things there. And the people of mixed European and African ancestry in Brazil were called mulattoes. And then there were even other categories like Africans who married or mixed with Native Americans were called, I believe, Zambos. So in Portugal, there's an extreme amount of mingling between various peoples and races, and that's even true today. The chapter section then goes on to talk about the social hierarchy in these societies. Lots of different groups, lots of mingling, but of course they're not all equal. At the top of the hierarchy, the top of the social pyramid, were Spanish or Portuguese people who migrated from the homeland. These were often people who came to rule, to govern the colonies, and then after a while would go back home. These were called peninsulares. And again, they are the very top of the social pyramid, especially the political elite. Below them were people known as Creoles or Criollos. We're familiar with the word Creole from places like Louisiana. Creole is kind of a French word. Criollos is Spanish, but they both essentially mean refer to people of European ancestry who were born and raised in the Americas. Again, they're essentially 100% pure-blooded Europeans, but born in the Americas, and they considered the Americas their home. They were just below the peninsulares, and they often constituted the economic and social elite. We'll talk in a little while about haciendas and mines and things, and it was the Creoles or Criollos who often owned these large estates, operated the mines, and constituted the economic elite of colonial society. Below Criollos or Creoles were the mestizos, who we know who they are, right? They some of them worked for Criollos. Some of them had their own small farms or businesses. But they're this vast middle group in Latin American society. Below them were, below mestizos were mulattoes, at least in the case of Brazil. Not many mulattoes in Mexico or the Spanish colonies in general, because there weren't many African slaves that went to those places. And then, of course, at the bottom of the pyramid were, in the case of Spanish America, the surviving Native Americans, the indigenous people, or in the case of Brazil, African slaves. So a number of these terms are on the list of key terms: Creoles, Criollos, mestizos, mulattoes. So just important to know who's who, where they stood in the hierarchy, and what type of economic functions they fulfilled in these societies. The section also talks about sexual hierarchies. Race and ethnicity, of course, were extremely important in determining your place in the social hierarchy, but gender did as well. These colonial societies, like those back home, were patriarchal. In fact, the colonial ones were often even more patriarchal than the ones back home. But it makes a point of stressing that not all women found themselves in exactly the same position. People in the Criollos or the Peninsulares, the women in those families, of course, enjoyed lots of privileges because their families were at the top of the social and economic pyramid. But they often had very confined and restricted lives, not allowed much freedom at all to get out, mix, and mingle with other people. And in contrast, the people at the bottom, women in mestizo or Native American categories, of course, they're poor, but because they needed to work, they were allowed to, mix and mingle, go out in public more than some of those in the upper classes. So it's hard to categorize all women as experiencing this or that form of discrimination or oppression. But clearly, again, it was far better to be a man in this colonial society than to be a woman in terms of the freedoms and opportunities that you were able to enjoy. North America, again, is a little bit of a different story. We talked about that earlier in terms of how North American colonies, especially those of the English, enjoyed more self-government, had a different relationship with indigenous people. And I think we might also have mentioned that the settler colonies, as they were called in North America, tended to have very few or very small degree of mingling with the native population because the settlers came already with their wives and families. After talking about the social hierarchies or social patterns, this section looks at some of the economic activities that occurred in the colonies. In the case of the Spanish Empire, it points out mining and agriculture were the two most important branches of economic activity. If you remember the conquistadors, of course, they were looking for wealth, and it often was in the form of gold or silver. Gold, of course, was more valuable, but silver was much more plentiful in the Americas than gold. And it especially could be found in a couple places, one in northern Mexico and another major center of silver producing or silver mining was down in the Andes in, I believe it's modern day Peru, at a place called Potosi. That's a key term. It talks about how Potosi was one of the largest silver mining operations anywhere in the world at the time, and soon had a population over 100,000. Of course, to mine silver or any other mineral, it requires a lot of labor. And as we saw in the first lecture, the Europeans did not particularly like heavy, dangerous labor. So, of course, they relied on Native American labor to mine the silver in places like Potosi. But interesting enough, to get that labor, they adopted or modified a Inca practice called mita, where the Inca government had required, every village to send a certain number of people to work for it for a number of months out of the year. So the Spanish sort of take this over and modify it to suit their own needs. Of course, they often treated the natives worse than the Incas had, but that was sort of the nature of the game at the time. It points out that the silver that they extracted from Potosi, most of it, of course, either stayed in Latin America, the Spanish Empire, or was sent back home to Spain, and from Spain it made its way to other parts of Europe as the Spanish bought things from France or England or Italy, wherever, or the Spanish army, which tended to go lots of places in Europe, where the Spanish army spent the silver there. But if you recall from chapter 19, the Manila galleons, and how Manila galleons carried Mexican silver to the Philippines and then on to China to get Asian goods, close to, I think it was 25% or 30% of the silver that came out of the Spanish colonies in the Americas ended up in China in particular. All right. Agriculture took a lot of forms, but the book focuses on the hacienda, again, a word that many of you probably have heard in other contexts. It's a large estate, often for raising cattle, but also could be for growing various types of cash crops. Haciendas, of course, tended to be owned by the criollos, and were worked by mestizos. The haciendas at first tended to rely on encomienda as a way of getting labor. Hopefully you can remember encomienda as that type of forced labor that the Spanish had first created in the Caribbean and then got transported into the rest of Latin America with the conquistadors and others. But encomienda had a number of problems, and over time it declined and was eventually replaced with what became known as debt peonage, which is discussed in a section under labor systems on, I think it's page 401. Debt peonage is a lot like what we would be familiar with sharecropping in the United States, that the people working on the hacienda or working on the estate would borrow money, borrow goods to get by. There's the debt part. And they'd, of course, have to pay that back somehow. But because the way things were rigged, they never usually made enough profits to pay back the whole debt. And so it becomes an endless cycle in which they and their families are forced to stay and work on the haciendas pretty much forever, or from generation to generation. And that's what the word peonage means, that you're just not free to leave. So debt peonage, like encomienda, and mita, were all systems of labor developed or used by the Spanish to get work from the Native American population, or later the mestizos, because, again, lots of land, lots of resources in Spanish America, but not a lot of people after all the death caused by epidemics and diseases that had wiped out the native population. Naturally enough, a lot of the surviving natives and even some of the mestizos were not wildly enthusiastic about this type of labor system and other arrangements. And it points out in the book that they tried to resist or oppose Spanish rule in a number of ways, sometimes appealing to the Spanish authorities and Spanish laws for protection. In fact, encomienda was eventually outlawed or disbanded by the Spanish government because of all the problems associated with it. And sometimes by trying to escape, run away and hide, or to rebel. Although in most cases the rebellions failed and the Spanish were able to continue to dominate. After talking about the Spanish colonial economy, the section looks at Brazil. And as we mentioned in the first lecture, it was sugar that was most important in the Brazilian economy, at least after a generation or two. Now, sugar production is a little bit different than growing most crops, because you have to process the sugar or sugar cane before you get the sugar. So it required not just labor, but a lot of, equipment, investment in machinery and buildings to make this work. So the sugar mills or sugar plantations required quite a bit of investment, and the book refers to engenho. This is a Portuguese word for one of these sugar plantations or sugar mills. And although very expensive to create and to operate, they produced enormous profits, in part, of course, because the actual labor was done by slaves. The slaves were resorted to fairly quickly by the Portuguese in Brazil, because it was virtually impossible for them to get the natives to work on it, or to force the natives to work on it, because they would just run away and vanish into the jungles. Slaves, of course, were taken primarily from Africa. The I guess it'd be the west coast of Africa. And if you look at a map, the distance between the west coast of Africa and Brazil is not all that great. And a very lively slave trade grew up in the late 1500s, early 1600s, run by the Portuguese to fuel the demand for labor in the sugar plantations. And the book points out rightly how brutal this was in terms of the economic calculation, that it was far cheaper for the owners of the sugar plantations to essentially work slaves to death and then go get new ones rather than to take good care of the ones they already had. All right, so that's the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire in Brazil, and now let's look at North America in terms of the economic patterns there. And it's very different, mainly because North America was not terribly well suited for a lot of the cash crops that were so important in Latin America. But the English and French both found ways to make them profitable. In the case of the French, it was primarily a fur trade. Furs were a very important commodity because before central heat and air, people had a difficult time keeping warm. And furs were one of the main items of clothing that you could wear to help stay warm. So the French engaged in a very important and valuable fur trade up in Canada. And the book points out that as the fur trade grew and the French got natives to help them with it, it often led to a lot of conflict and violence between different Indian tribes as they moved or entered into each other's territories in the pursuit of furs. In English colonies, of course, there were some furs there too, but more important was farming, agriculture again. But instead of sugar, it was mainly tobacco that was the most valuable cash crop. And of course, this was grown primarily in Virginia and the mid-Atlantic states. And it became a very profitable crop by the 1600s. Because, as we all know, tobacco or nicotine is very addictive, and as the practice spread, it was pretty much self-sustaining. Growing tobacco is a little bit easier than growing sugar, but it's still not a very pleasant activity. And so the English landowners also had to prefer to get other people to work for them. And because they couldn't get natives to do it, they had to find somebody else. In this case, their first choice were other Europeans. Poor Europeans would enter into contracts with the landowners. They would get free passage over to the New World and then have to work for the landowners for a certain period of time. It varied, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And at the end of that time, they would be, quote unquote, free, and then they could go get some land of their own. This was what was called indentured servitude. And it was a fairly common practice in the English colonies for the first 100 years or so. So again, here's labor. Indentured labor is not quite as severe or coercive as the encomienda or debt peonage or mita, but it's still a way of getting labor from someone else under fairly unfavorable conditions for the worker. Although it worked in general, it had some problems, some shortcomings from the perspective of the landowners. And after a generation or two, they started using more and more slaves. So slavery became an institution in North America. just as it did in the Caribbean and Latin America. Of course, primarily in the southern states where tobacco could be grown, and then later on, of course, things like cotton, rice, and other cash crops. Um, so slavery in the colonies, the English colonies, really begins to grow in the late 1600s and 1700s. And as it takes hold in the American South, some of the colonists, the businesses up in the northern colonies, get into the act by helping provide the ships that bring the slaves to the southern colonies, or they process the tobacco and sugar and other things that are grown by slaves in the South or in the Caribbean region. So, although the practice was mainly in the South, it was an integral part of the entire economy of English North America. The last section in the book here on the colonial society talks about religion and the spread of Christianity, and how it was adopted or not adopted by various Native American people. The people who were the Europeans who were most dedicated to spreading Christianity among the natives were the Spanish, and Spanish created lots of missions throughout Mexico, the American Southwest, Latin America, to help convert the natives. And although the natives often resisted over time, it did become the dominant religion. Although the book does point out that even when they adopted Christianity, the natives often kept elements of their traditional religion and kind of blended the two. And in fact, when we talk about chapter 22, Africa, we're going to hear a word called syncretic. It's not on our list of terms now, but it's one that you should know. Syncretic refers to kind of a synthesis, a blend of various cultural practices or ideas, and that is certainly the case here in the Spanish colonies, where the Roman Catholic religion took hold, but was practiced in ways that did preserve a certain amount of native traditions. And this is reflected in, for example, the cult or worship of the so-called Virgin of Guadalupe. The book talks about it in, I think it's page 404. And there's a little picture there showing a painting of the Virgin, and how, according to this, the Virgin Mary appeared to a peasant, a mestizo peasant, and that this site became a major pilgrimage location. People would go there to be cured of diseases or other things. There's lots of stories about miracles being worked, and of course, this helped the Christian faith become more popular, especially among the mestizo and lower classes, because again, this was sort of associated with, I mean, the Virgin had visited, a poor person and not a Creole or Peninsulare. It talks then about the French and English missionary activity, and it was far less intensive and far less successful than the Spanish, in part because in French and English North America, most Indians moved around a lot. They were nomadic or semi-nomadic, and it was a lot harder to do missionary work among people who moved a lot than those who stayed put. And to be honest, the English had very little interest in spreading the religion to the natives. They tended to kind of see them as irredeemable savages and kind of just kept their religion, like themselves, to themselves. The last part of chapter 21 talks about Europeans in the Pacific, And as we said at the start, there's really not a whole lot in this section that we need to concern ourselves with in terms of key terms or things that are going to be on the quizzes or tests. So we'll content ourselves by pointing out that what happened in the Pacific in many ways was very similar to what happened in the Americas. It just occurred over a longer period of time, and it really wasn't until the 1800s that large numbers of Europeans actually started settling or colonizing the islands of the Pacific or Oceania. Of course, the largest island is Australia, and chapter talks a little bit about how Australia was explored first by the Dutch as they were setting up their empire in their trading post empire in the Indian Ocean. But there was very little that they saw there that interested them. They didn't see much profit there because of the terrain, and the people were, the Aborigines living there were clearly not civilized and did not have goods or things that the Dutch wanted. So it wasn't until the British in the 1700s that Europeans first started to settle or colonize Australia. And of course, hopefully everyone remembers Captain Cook from chapter 19, how he explored the Pacific, and part of that involved exploring the eastern coast of Australia. And here in this chapter it talks about how Cook helped establish the first permanent British settlement in Australia at a place called Botany Bay. Interesting aspect of Botany Bay is that most of the colonists who went there over the first 50, 60 years were mainly prisoners that the English government shipped to Australia to get them out of England. So this is a very sort of unusual pattern of settlement. Even today there are Australians who trace their ancestry back to these early prisoners, and a certain amount of pride in being, among them. In terms of the other islands of the Pacific, again, there's thousands of them. Most of them, of course, were of little interest to the Europeans, but the book mentions a number of them. Guam, for example, was settled by the Spanish mainly because it was a place to stop on the way to the Philippines in the Manila Galleon trade. In the case, there mentions Tahiti, Hawaii. These were places discovered by Captain Cook again. And first, again, not many Europeans went there. A few mariners, whalers, but large-scale colonization really doesn't begin until the early mid-1800s, especially in Hawaii. But that's really a story for another chapter. So the European impact in the Pacific and Oceania is really not going to be tremendous until late 1700s, early 1800s. But again, as in the Americas, the impact is largely negative in terms of the destruction, the undermining of the societies that had been there for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. All right, so that wraps up chapter 22. I will be back in town and be able to talk to you in person about chapters 22, 23, 24, 25, and so on and so forth. So hopefully you've gotten something out of this lecture and the one before it. If not, we won't do it again. Bye.